Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner, and with me this evening is our co-host Jane Faherty from the Stamford Jewish Community Center. She is the director of the JumpStart program. I am an attorney in the field of special education law. For all of us who are here, we're Connecticut-based. We have many guests from other parts of the country and other countries, but all of our information is Connecticut based. We have our contact information, bios in the chat section of the webinar. We've received many questions. We'll do our best to get to those questions prior to tonight's webinar. If you do have a question during the webinar, we ask that you put your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of your computer. This webinar is being recorded, and information in the chat is recorded. Information in the Q&A is not. Before I get into any further, I just want to give a disclaimer. As I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be provided to each person who's been registered for the webinar. The information provided during tonight's webinar does not constitute specific legal advice, professional advice, advocacy advice regarding you or your child, and should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with attorney Lawrence Berliner, myself, a professional relationship with Jane Faherty, a professional or the Stamford Jewish Community Center, or a professional relationship with Allie Grafman, one of our guests we'll get to in a moment, or Caryl Frankenberger and Frankenberger Associates, who will be introducing yourself in a few moments. By signing up, you've agreed to receive future information about our webinars and events from the Stamford Jewish Community Center, the law office of Lawrence Berliner. Please note this is being recorded on Zoom. Zoom is a third-party provider and not an agent or associated with the law office of Lawrence Berliner, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, Allie Grafman, Jane Faherty, or Caryl Frankenberger. Information provided during the webinar is based upon Connecticut law, policies, and federal law. If you are from another state or country, you should consult the laws and policies that are in effect in your jurisdiction. So without further ado, Jane and I have, Jane, what is this? We've been doing this for 3 years now, is that? Or we're going into our 4th year, I forget.
Actually, three and a half years. We started March of 2020. But before that, Lawrence, we did them in person at the JCC prior to that time.
Okay. We are continuing our efforts to present Zoom webinars because we are part of a community of concerned parents and professionals, and we are still all learning how to connect with one another. For the past 3.5 years, we've been moderating a series of webinars to address these concerns that are presented to us in these unprecedented times. The needs are there to address social and emotional and the educational impact upon our students, whether it's your child or a professional or an educator who's in your classroom, so their journey will be successful. And that is especially true today because we have been seeing results from NWEA. I just saw something with the ACT the other night, where there are now measurable impacts on students' achievement using those test measures, often created by the learning loss due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess in many ways, we're still dealing with it, even though we're back to school. Tonight, we'll be discussing what's on the minds of many parents and others who have submitted questions now that the 23-24 school year is underway. And each school year, creates a new beginning, the highest of hopes and expectations. And Jane and I and our 2 special guests will be attempting to address those questions. how to empower parents when your child is showing struggles at school, how to cope with back to school issues and beyond, monitoring progress at school, preparing for PPT meetings. That's what we call them here in Connecticut. They have other names in other states. I have available top 10 strategies. I believe it's on the chat section to help take ownership in your child's education. And this is a resource that I try to update each school year, so parents can understand the IEP process, familiar yourself with the terms and acronyms. We have a new IEP format that's been in effect for a year now. There are still questions about that new IEP. Making sure that you understand what's going on in school, you have a working relationship with school staff, and you know how to articulate your concerns if you're a parent and advocate for those concerns if you're a parent or a student, because students eventually should be developing what are called self-advocacy skills. Those are just a few of the many strategies that are in the top 10. So without further ado, I will let Jane take over, and then we'll have Caryl Frankenberger and then Allie Grafman give a brief background of their experience, what they do. Allie is an advocate, and Caryl is an evaluator. I'm an attorney, and Jane is both the director of the preschool program called JumpStart, and she's also a tireless and dedicated advocate. So Jane, what's up?
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence. It's lovely to be back here tonight, and it's really great to have Allie and Caryl here to join in the conversation. As Lawrence said, I'm the executive director of a program called JumpStart, located both in the Stamford JCC and also at the Maritime Odyssey Preschool in Norwalk. So the program primarily supports children with developmental disabilities aged between 2 and 3. I then help those children transition into the public school. And as I've been doing this for nearly 10 years, I continue to have a relationship with some of those students and help with any IEPs and any advocacy that might be required in their elementary schools. And I also have my own private practice advocating for students at Fairfield as well. The great thing about the work that I do and that Lawrence does with these webinars is that we get to meet some really champions within our community who provide excellent resources to families in so many different ways. Allie is back with us as an advocate to help answer some of the questions we received prior to tonight and during this conversation. But we're really lucky to have Caryl Frankenberger here today as well to talk about evaluations and the services that she offers within her organization too. Evaluations are a key component of understanding a child's needs, a student's needs, and how those can be met with the support and obviously in collaboration with a district or with a school. So without further ado, I look forward to hearing from Caryl, and here she is tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Larry. I'm Caryl Frankenberger, and I am an evaluator. I am also the executive director of Frankenberger Associates. We're a learning solutions center that provides a myriad of services to children and their families. We offer evaluations, several different kinds of evaluations, which perhaps we'll talk about tonight. We do executive function coaching, tutoring in all academic subjects with reading remediation and math remediation. We run a social learning program using peers and Michelle Garcia Winner's social thinking methodology. We have an occupational therapist, some behavioral analysts, licensed clinical social worker. So we try to offer a very wide range of services for children and their families. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Allie Grafman. I am a special education advocate, and I've been doing this for just about 10 years now. It's hard to believe, but 10 years ago, I retired from public education. I was a special education teacher and then became a administrator in special education, working through the PPT or the IEP process. I I just love what I do working with families because I see the results, and so many families feel not just the appreciation, but the support that can be received through advocacy. I certainly work with resources within the community, professionals, evaluators such as Caryl, and then work with families to prepare them for PPTs. I often participate in PPTs and network, as I said, with resources. So I'm thrilled to be back. I love this format of conversation, and hopefully we'll get to the questions that are most pertinent to everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, that's a lot. I don't know where you want to start. I mean, before we logged on, I found one of tonight's questions most interesting to me. And looks like a parent had asked what options are available when you can't afford an advocate. Where do parents find information? And we would like to believe that these webinars is one of many sources of providing information. And if you can't afford an advocate or an attorney, there are many resources out there on the internet, good resources, the U.S. Department of Education, the Connecticut Department of Education. There are some organizations here in Connecticut, the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center, sometimes known as CPAC, has a lot of information. They're running webinars and training. They have, I think, Monday through Friday, a call-in service to answer questions. We have Faherty, which is a private not-for-profit up in the Hartford area that provides some limited advocacy services. And some parents have been able to obtain grants from a special education legal fund known as SELF, S-E-L-F. And so there's information tonight, information from the U.S. Department of Education, State Department of Education, CPAC. And so sometimes you just need to dig, and you will find that information readily available, user-friendly, and especially on the State Department of Education, their information increasingly is in many languages, many like 10 or 12, not just English, Spanish. So if you need a language, information in a language other than English or Spanish, our State Department of Education has been providing a lot more of their publications, I think somewhere around 10, 12 different languages.
There's also COPA, the Council of Parents, Advocates and Attorneys, which is actually where I did my formal certification to become an advocate. I did my Seat 2 training. But COPA is also an organization, even if you don't go on to do their formal training program as an advocate, they have great articles and are a great resource to go to understand elements of how to advocate for your child in the public school system. And if you really want a good read, you could read the IEDA document and understand the nuances. Failing that, that's why we do these webinars, to try and provide information for you that's relevant to you, which is why we like to answer your questions that you've sent ahead of time and also during the session.
Caryl, what do you do as an evaluator for those who are unfamiliar with the role of a private evaluator?
Well, it depends on what evaluation you're looking for. There are several different types of evaluations. Dyslexia evaluations, if your child has reading issues, you can get a dyslexia evaluation that really hones in on the reading, writing, and spelling processes, that really looks at phonological awareness and the underpinnings of the reading process. Word retrieval and vocabulary development. Those are the kinds of tests that one wants to give in a dyslexia evaluation. Moving upward, you can do an educational evaluation, which includes everything but an IQ test. So that would be things like looking at all of your academics, your reading, writing, spelling, and math, your memory, executive functioning, and then your psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluations, which are your largest evaluations, which have the IQ test and then all the supporting tests. And there are many, many tests out there. So getting an evaluation that only has an achievement test and a cognitive test probably isn't enough to really give you a full picture of your child. So you have to dig deep there and ask and request for all the ancillary. Well, they're not really ancillary, they're very important. You know, memory is really an important cognitive function. We need to be able to evaluate for that. Executive functioning, ADHD. So that's a more broad-based evaluation.
How would a parent know what evaluation to ask for? And if a district said, oh, yes, we're doing this type of evaluation, how would a parent know if it was the correct tool to use? What additional questions should they ask to make sure that the right tools are being used for their child?
That's a really good question. I think the parents have to know some of the struggles that their child's having, basic struggles, like if it is a reading evaluation, then you want to make sure that they have really delved deep into the reading process and have tests of phonological processing, and not just one reading test like a standardized achievement test, but reading of words, sentences, phrases, nonsense words, of course, real words, paragraphs, and then, of course, the comprehension piece. So there needs to be some reading of passages with comprehension questions. So that's a fairly large reading battery. Oftentimes I see, you know, a list of words have been read and a reading score is given. And that doesn't really reflect, you've got rapid naming, fluency, speed of processing. All of those things are part of the reading process that need to be evaluated. So if you know your child, particularly for parents who have young children, you know your child has a reading issue, then you would ask for something very specific and have them dig really deep. Sometimes you don't know what the problem is, you just know that there's a problem. And in that case, I would ask for a usually the schools aren't going to do a neuropsychological, they're going to do what's called a psychoeducational. And that should include all of the academics, reading, writing, spelling, math, definitely memory, executive functioning, graphomotor, so fine motor, weaknesses, to look for fine motor weaknesses, and your rating scales, which will look at ADHD, social emotional functioning, anxiety, depression, OCD, those kinds of things. The school system, and Larry, correct me, and well, all of you correct me if I'm mistaken, but it is not going to do projectives or social emotional. They will do rating scales, but they're not going to diagnose somebody with anxiety or ADHD, or perhaps even dyslexia, although I think things are really getting better. And I have seen some schools diagnose kids with dyslexia, which is just terrific.
Caryl, just to add to that, I like what you said. If parents don't really know, they just kind of know that their kid is struggling, I would go for the neuropsych, because that encompasses everything. As an advocate, oftentimes I will ask the school to do a complete file review. And the advantage of a file review is to go back in history, because often when kids struggle, it just doesn't start like right away. You see signs of it, like, red flags. They may be obscure and not as evident, but starting way back, kindergarten, first grade. And so the file review will help, I think, put together the pieces of the puzzle and kind of hone in on some of the target areas that you want. I also ask my clients, and I work with them on developing questions before any evaluation. I think that's really essential, to have questions, and I invite the school to do the same thing, because that will drive what the evaluator needs to work through and process and target. So those questions, I think, are valuable, because the parents definitely have a different perspective than the school does. So their questions could be quite different. Mm-hmm. Yes, if they are similar, but often they are different.
That is so true. And we shouldn't forget our occupational therapy evals, our speech language evals. those would be separate in the public school system. They would be separate, evaluations, but those are really equally important for kids that need those services.
And Lawrence, what should parents do if they ask for evaluations from the public school and they are denied that opportunity through the public school? What recourse do they have at that point?
Well, there's several answers. It depends whether a child has an IEP or should have an IEP. What happens with special education, there are what are called procedural safeguards. And part of that procedural safeguard is a referral to special education, a prompt referral under state law. When a child is struggling in school, their behaviors, their attendance, their academic performance is at a marginal or unacceptable level of just an unacceptable level. And what's supposed to happen in Connecticut, we have PPT meetings, and that's the point in time to put your concerns down on the table, request an evaluation, let the school do the evaluation. If that doesn't happen, then parents certainly have an option to obtain their own private evaluation. And on rare occasions, health insurance will pay for some of the evaluation. Most of the time, they won't. And so sometimes it's a resource issue trying to find an organization or a qualified professional to complete an evaluation. And then what I often do is give notice of the private evaluation and a corresponding request to be reimbursed after the fact for the cost of the evaluation. Information, data, anecdotal, formal is vital. It's critical. Parents are a very important source of information. The federal law is very clear when we go to PPT meetings. The PPT is supposed to consider the concerns of the parents for enhancing their child's education. That's the law. And so you need to go to the PPT meeting with a list of your concerns. And if there are no evaluations or evaluations are incomplete and there should be more, then ask the school district to do the evaluations. No one knows your child better than you do as a parent. Teachers and educators see your child in one setting, that's called school. That's their vantage point, that's their perspective. But you have, as parents, a much larger vantage point because you see your child at school, at home, out in the community, playground, social situations, wherever you and your child are interacting in the larger world. And that's important data that parents can bring to the school district, because if a child has supposedly learned a skill at school, they should be able to generalize the skill at home or out in the community. So when that's not happening, people like Caryl, other specialists, Caryl mentioned occupational therapists, speech and language, there's a whole host of professionals out there, neuropsychologists, psychologists, reading consultants, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language pathologists, audiologists in some cases. Pediatricians are often a very good starting point for this process because they have that unique ability, if they've been following your child for a long period of time, to give you perspective and often referrals or resources to tap into. And then, as I mentioned, your information as parents. We have a question that came in on the Q&A. School says everything is fine, but my child has meltdowns at home and unravels. Well, clearly something is going on at school, and the student holds it together and lets it all out at home. Well, that's not a home issue. That's a student coming home with everything bottled up, and home is warm, it's fuzzy. Parents are non-judgmental, unlike school. I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of my peers. So the parents end up having to pick up the pieces at home for something that happened at school, and they have no idea what's going on. So from my perspective, we need information. Is it a functional behavioral assessment? That's another type of assessment. Do we need some kind of medical intervention? That's another area. Schools don't do that one. Typically, that's handled privately. So there's a whole array of resources out there, starting with the parents' concerns as to what's happening with their child. And that's why it's a multifaceted answer. If we have an initial evaluation in Connecticut, schools have 45 school days to complete that evaluation and have a PPTV on the calendar. If it's a reevaluation, there's no precise timeline. Words like reasonable are used. And one of the important procedural safeguards, if you disagree with a school district evaluation, you have a right to request a publicly funded independent evaluation. And the school districts have two choices. They can say yes, and you get to select the evaluator and they pay for it. Or if they say no, they have to file for a due process hearing. So it's very important that you know your rights and how to access those rights when you're requesting a publicly funded independent evaluation.
This was
just to add quickly to that, Attorney Berliner, what I will often suggest to parents if they get some pushback from the school on getting an initial evaluation or any evaluation would be to get a letter from a professional, like either their physician, psychologist, social worker, who's ever working with the child outside of school, because that will hold a lot of weight and bring it to the school, and then the school would be aware of the fact that it's not just the parents that are seeing this, it's also the outside professional. And the school does have the responsibility for what we call child find, which is to identify students that are struggling and to evaluate them for any disability. So you are kind of bringing it to a different level, asking for a professional letter, recognizing or requesting an evaluation for your child.
I was going to say too, this was a question.
I was just going to add to that, make sure you're doing things in writing. That's all I was going to add. So you have a written record. So.
Yeah, and talking about written records, we had a question that was in before the webinar, talking about the difference between when you're working with a child as a parent in elementary school, where maybe you have fewer educators involved, versus middle school, where maybe your student's day gets more complicated and there's more teachers involved. So the question was, what's the best way to monitor your child's progress at school when in middle school with multiple teachers involved? And this is to each of you, because at this point, your child might be exploring science in more depth, social studies curriculum in more depth, as well as mathematics or English. So you might start to see your child performing differently in the different academic disciplines and areas as well. So Carol, Allie, or Lawrence, any suggestions on how to monitor progress once in middle school and you've made that transition?
Well, middle school and high school do get more complicated because you are dealing with a network of teachers and also service providers. It depends what you mean by progress. If you're talking about a student with an IEP, are you talking about progress on the IEP, or are you talking about progress in classes like in math or science or language arts, where the grades are plummeting? So if it is about the IEP, you really need to take a look at the goals and objectives and start with the baseline. How was the student functioning at the onset when this particular goal or objective was developed? And then ask for data. Data drives instruction. It's really important that parents get this data. And you, as a parent, a guardian, you are privy to any of the data-driven assessments that are being administered to your child. So ask for the data. And if you don't see an upward swing in the progress, you know that your child is either at a status quo or regressing or not making adequate progress. So then you go back to a PPT and you really have to look at those goals and objectives and either revise them or again reevaluate, so you know really what you are targeting. Maybe the objective is not targeting the exact problem, and that is often the case. If your child is struggling in academic classes, and that's where you say that, or you ask yourself, why is he or she not making progress? All schools give what we call a not baseline, but performance-based assessments. They are assessments that are either by the state or they are administered by the district themselves. So whether it's some schools use STAR assessment, and there's others as well. If you see that there is ongoing history with these performance assessments, you know that your child is not making progress from one year to the next. They also administer these assessments throughout the same school year. So they may give one, let's say this time of year, and then another one in January or February, and another one in the spring. If you see that the progress is either, again, status quo or dropping, then you need to go back to a PPT. But there are many measures of progress, and it depends really what you are looking at to determine what the problem is.
Most of the progress is on the new IEP format in Connecticut is called progress monitoring. And it's supposed to be in writing. It's not supposed to be in somebody's head. And so if, as Allie mentioned, if they're using STAR testing or NWEA testing or DIBELS or Ames Web, they're all kinds of progress monitoring. The Smarter Balance, the SBAC testing. You need to start at a baseline, including your own wisdom and intuition as parents and knowledge. Again, as I mentioned before, if a child has learned something at school, they should be able to generalize it to home and other settings. If that's not happening, that's data from a parent's perspective. And this is where going into the school records, which you have a right to receive a copy of your child's records, you can determine whether or not they're receiving what is called a free appropriate public education. That's the legal equation of what every child with an IEP is entitled to in all 50 states, free appropriate public education. Free is without direct cost to a parent. Public and education is what school districts are. And it's the word appropriate that we're often arguing over because it was never defined by Congress. It's a word like reasonable. What I think is reasonable, you might feel is unreasonable, and vice versa. But there are some outer contours as to what is appropriate, as in free appropriate public education. Is there an IEP? Did you get your notice of a PPT meeting? Do we have the timelines adhered to? Those are procedural requirements. When you get to the IEP, is it based upon what your child's unique needs are or what's available in the building or the district? And that is very important. It can't be what's called a categorical decision. It has to be an individualized decision. And once you have all of that information in the IEP, we have a section called the present level of academic and functional performance, which lists strengths and weaknesses. And when you do an apples to apples comparison over time, are the gaps widening or are the gaps narrowing? And if the gaps are widening and you're not getting an adequate response from the school district, there may be some environmental reasons, neurological reasons. Sometimes there are very legitimate reasons why a student is not making meaningful educational progress. If you're not getting the answers you need, then you need to consider somebody like Caryl. And that is where we get the private evaluations. I use a phrase, a deeper dive. Some of the private evaluators do a deeper dive into a student's strengths or weaknesses and might be in a position to identify something that was missed by the school district or the school district's assessment. Allie mentioned the periodic assessments. It took me a little time to figure out what boy, moi, and oi meant. And that stands for beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year assessments. It took me a little bit of time. There, you have to understand the acronyms, and that was one I didn't understand until I started figuring it out after seeing it a couple of times. Beginning of the year, that's your baseline. Middle of the year, there's a data point. End of the year, another data point. Are the arrows trending upwards? In other words, the progress is there, the gaps are closing, or not. And if the answer is not, then potentially there's a denial of a free, appropriate public education. And that's where you need to bring in advocates, attorneys, evaluators, anybody that's going to help you establish where the educational wheels are going off the track.
I think one of the most important things as an advocate that I feel highly strongly about is expectations. And this is where evaluations are incredibly important. If we can understand the baseline data of where a child is currently at, and we can understand how that child navigates their academic world and environment by doing a deeper dive into their cognitive levels or their executive functioning, and then apply the tools. The thing that I get very disheartened by is IEP goals and objectives, which have a very low level of expectation for mastery. If we have a neurotypical student, parents might be striving for, high grades, A's and B's, but quite often you see with an IEP that a school district might be satisfied with a 70%, which would be a C, and that wouldn't necessarily be mastery. So I think that when we're looking at goals and objectives and we're understanding the student, we should always maintain a high expectation for all our students to reach their maximum full potential, not just get by and not just pass, but actually excel and exceed in whichever skill we're looking for them to master or acquire or accomplish. And quite often, I see districts say, okay, they've done this, tick that box, let's move on. Passing does not necessarily mean that it's been mastered. And so appropriate education is also having a high standard and expectation for each and every one of our students, and not to compromise because they have less skills potentially than some of their neurotypical peers. So for me, expectations is really important, and that's where the information that Caryl can provide as an evaluator can really help the district understand how to help this child meet their full potential. And we should always have the expectation that every student can meet their individual full potential, and that's why data is very important to collect as well. Just because a child is an IEP or 504 doesn't mean we should be satisfied with them attaining mediocre grades. We should always be striving for everybody to be the best that they can be, and quite often that doesn't always happen, but evaluations can help us build those expectations with the PPT team.
Jane, I'm glad you had expectations on the IEP, because I think it's really important that parents look at the way the goal and objective especially is written. It can be very misleading. Oftentimes, objectives are developed by saying with prompts or with teacher support or in a structured setting. That doesn't mean that your child can, that your child's goal is measured independently. It is measured as it is written with that support or in a setting. And oftentimes it's stated that the goal will be met with maybe 3 consecutive trials, okay? Well, what is 3 consecutive trials? Just what it says. After 3 consecutive trials, the student mastered it, okay, bye-bye goal, now we're on to something else. That doesn't mean that your child generalized this. That doesn't mean that your child maintains this. That doesn't mean that your child can functionally utilize it spontaneously. So you really have to look at these goals and objectives and the way they're written to really understand progress and what that means.
I wanted to add one more piece, and that is I often see that ADHD becomes the label, and that students' reading is often attributed to their being ADHD, particularly in the younger grades. So, and in first and second grade, your child is diagnosed with ADHD. Just be cautious that the child's challenges are not all attributed to ADHD. Yes, they may be inattentive, they may have self-regulation issues, impulse control problems, but that doesn't mean that their reading is negatively impacted. It's not causing them not to be able to master the code or the writing process. And I see that often, and I just caution parents to keep that in mind and always dig a little bit deeper.
I just want to add to that and just give a question to Caryl. The IEP is not written for what box of eligibility or category of eligibility is checked off. It's based upon the student's needs. So you could in Connecticut, we only recognize a primary disability, but that doesn't mean there's not a secondary or tertiary disability that's adversely affecting the child's education. So using Carol's example, you could have a primary disability with ADHD, but you can't write the IEP in a way that ignores the learning challenges with reading if that's an area of difficulty. We write the IEP for the student's unique individual needs and not the label. We received a question. It was sort of an interesting way it was structured. How do you make the public school tests for learning disabilities if they are hard of hearing? And when I first saw the question, I said, who's hard of hearing? The school? They're not listening to the parents, or the child has a hearing impairment. So I'm going to assume this parent has a child with a hearing impairment. Is there a special way that we test children with learning disabilities if they are hearing impaired?
I don't know. I mean, I think you would certainly have to get an auditory processing evaluation, but someone who has that specialization would probably have to do that in order to have it be a fair evaluation.
Within a district, you should have a hearing specialist that is able to consult with the team and to help the team make modifications and adaptations, not only to access a curriculum, but also to find ways to help a child access testing as well. So that would be somewhere to start. Ask your district to consult with their hearing specialist. If a district doesn't have a hearing specialist, then there are different organizations that they can consult with, just as you can if you have a visual impairment. They quite often will consult with BESB. So the recommendation would be that if they don't have the expertise in district, that you connect them to the larger state organizations that have those experts that can come in and work with the districts and the teams and the educators to help ensure that that child's educational needs are being met. Because if you're not sure how to test, are you even delivering the educational curriculum appropriately and correctly as well? I would be concerned about that too.
As an advocate, we have worked with the State Department of Education. They will send a teacher of the hearing impaired to the school to work with the team to decide what testing needs to be done and how it's done. So oftentimes, depending upon the severity of the hearing impairment, if you need somebody to sign the tests or whatever support you need to test the student, the teacher of the hearing impaired will come and work with the team. I believe it's through BRS, the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services, does provide that level of support.
We have two questions that are pretty much the same side of the coin. And one part of the question is what's considered good progress? And the other question is what happens if my child has regressed 100% and the school is not helping? That, from a legal perspective, that's the free appropriate public education, which includes meaningful educational progress, not trivial progress. But I was wondering if Are there any other comments from our two guests and Jane as advocates and evaluators?
I think that goes back to data, which is what we always talk about, collecting data, collecting information from multiple sources, not only your anecdotal, but also look and track the progress. If you see that a child has not been making progress, then you need to call a PPT, you need to look into why they're not making the progress, maybe ask for more information, which is where someone like Caryl can also come in and really do a deep dive to find out why a child is not making progress and to help you collect data and information that can be shared with the team to provide more insight into how a child is navigating their learning environment and how the material is being presented to them and how they're extracting information from it.
I agree. Data, data, data. That's the key. Oftentimes, I will approach the issue about progress. The school wants to hear adequate progress, but that's kind of nebulous. What is adequate progress? So if the school says to you, oh, well, he made or she made 1 year's progress in 1 year, well, that sounds really good, but it really isn't, because every other child in that school, in the classroom, the expectation is that they make 1 year's progress within 1 year. So your child with a disability needs to close that gap and make more than 1 year's progress within the year. So that's the way you close the gap. So that's kind of the balance in the perspective that I use when they say, oh, they're making adequate progress. They made a year's progress. They have to make more. And that means intensifying the services, if necessary, going back to a PPT, get an evaluation to show where the baselines are, all of that we just talked about. But we need to close that gap, and we need to measure the child's progress against, or not against, but in comparison to state standards. And that's really important, that, you know, what are the grade level standards for your child? Is your child still remaining 2 to 3 years behind, even though he's making progress? That gap, 2 or 3 years, is significant, which means that, in my estimation, and I think as parents you would agree, that if that gap stays the same or increases, that is not adequate progress. So that's another way to kind of look at it through the state standards.
And as students get older and as they progress through the grades, the expectation is that they are independent after 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, and they have all the basic foundational skills, and they can leap tall buildings in a single bound academically. And often, in my experience, it starts to fall apart after 4th grade, middle school, and most definitely by the time we get to high school, when there are the fewest amount of supports, the greatest need for independence, dealing with a lot of complex math, reading inferential information. And if we have high expectations for our students to succeed, go off to college, get great jobs, do something meaningful, be happy, successful, and independent, then we have to create high expectations and not just, oh, well, this is the best they can do, or they need to try harder. If something is if the student has talent, and we can demonstrate that talent through standardized testing, for example, but they're not reaching that potential, you have a student who has solidly average to high average cognitive scores, but solidly below average achievement scores. What is the question I ask is, what is getting in the way of that student's ability to succeed? Is it some emotional issues at school? The pace of instruction. They're not getting enough support. I just had a parent call me the other day. He said, my son needs one-to-one or very small group instruction. The school said, we only have regular classes. Well, that's a denial of a free, appropriate public education, because it's categorical decision-making rather than individual decision-making. And all of this contributes to the denial of a free, appropriate public education. And then, as I said, and others have said, look at that baseline against the baseline 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Where are we today? Are the gaps closing or are they widening? The skills are evolving or not?
So Carol, one of the questions we just had in, it was on our group chat, was can you clarify the difference between psychoeducational evaluation the school provides and the psychoneuro evaluation that parents can request?
It really varies depending upon the school. I have seen some very, very good psychoeducational evaluations written by schools, public schools. They really are very, very thorough. I've also seen, I just received one, I was talking to Attorney Berliner about this today. It was an IQ test and an achievement test and some rating scales. That's just not enough information. So you have to know your district, and every district is different. Sometimes I'm, so pleasantly surprised, and sometimes I'm really very disappointed. So you have to ask those questions, and you have to ask for very specific, areas to be evaluated. If you say, I want a psychoeducational evaluation, I want it to include memory tests. I want it to include tests of executive functioning. I want it to include more than just an achievement test. Those are things you can ask your school system. And outside evaluation, to be really honest, it depends on the evaluator. Some people dig really, really deep and do a very thorough job in all of the areas, and some less so. And it just depends. Again, I would ask the questions so you really get what you want.
If you're a parent looking for an evaluation, obviously the length of time it takes to complete an evaluation may vary, but what would be realistic for parents to expect? How long would the timeline be between getting a private evaluation done and actually having the results and the information for that if they're thinking of presenting it at PPT or sharing that with the team?
A really good question, and it's so variable. I mean, you'd hope that you would have an evaluation, a wrap up with the parent within 3 to 4 weeks, you'd have a wrap up with the parent, and within 6 weeks, you'd have the written report. Anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks, you're going to have the written report, just depending on the evaluator. You'd like it to be, 4 weeks would be great, but they're very labor intensive. And it really does take time to write these and meet the individual, really to describe the student in a way that's really meaningful. When you get an evaluation, a private evaluation, you should read this and you should say, this is my child. I mean, this evaluator described my child beautifully. And now I understand, and they're difficult to read too, but now I understand strengths, challenges, average abilities. So to get back to your question, anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, I would say, which is a long time.
I think one of the advantages of a neuropsych compared to a psychoed that the school does, the school tends to, like, the school psychologists will do their components, which is usually the cognitive, maybe some executive functioning, some behavioral, checklists. They have their domain. Then the special ed teacher does his or her area, which is usually the academic. The OT and the speech and language, they do theirs. With the neuropsych, much of it is integrated. And I use that word integrated very carefully because it's usually the whole child that you're talking about. The recommendations that are made are based upon all of these results, not just what the psychologist said or what the special ed teacher said. It's the global, the universal. Carol, you said, the parents, this is my child. Do you really understand your child? You understand it because it's that integrative approach that you're taking. Naturally, the neuropsych doesn't necessarily get into the speech and language. You need a speech and language expert. You need an OT, but they come together and really collaborate and work with each other to come out with these recommendations from the evaluation. So I think that's probably one of the benefits of having a neuropsych compared to a fragmented approach, where I have to say, oftentimes you get to a PPT and the school psych doesn't read the special ed teacher's report or vice versa, and they're hearing it for the first time at the PPT. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are given a picture of the holistic learning profile of your child.
We had a couple of questions about students who live in one town, but they're educated in another school district. The short answer to that question, the place of residence where you live, where your child has their primary residence, is responsible for developing the IEP. They're called the sending school district. The receiving school district or the receiving school is supposed to implement the IEP. And if there's a problem with the IEP, go back to your home district, the sending district. I hope that answered those two questions. We also had a question about private schools and transition planning. And we may be having a webinar, Jane and I, later on about transition planning for students over 14 in Connecticut to work on post-secondary education skills, employment skills, and independent living skills. But in the context of the question we received tonight, are private schools required to create a transition plan? And this student apparently does not have a 504 plan or an IEP, but what's called a services plan. And I won't get into the details of a services plan. The answer is no, as a matter of law, but as a matter of school policy and contract, between you as a parent and the school district, they may offer transition planning. Some of the private preparatory schools have college counselors. So their goal is primarily to get you into a good college if you're a high school student, but they're not necessarily working on the employment or the independent living piece. There are transition evaluators out there who could do a transition evaluation that could help you identify strengths and weaknesses for post-secondary education, employment, independent living. But if your child has an IEP, they're most definitely entitled to a transition evaluation and a transition, a portion of the IEP with transition goals and objectives that will prepare a student for if they're going off to college or community college or vocational training, wherever they're going after high school, as far as their education, making sure they have the skills necessary to get a job, keep a job. And if they need help, independent living, driving, not driving, money management, meal preparation, budgeting, whatever the independent living skills are, that's a school district's responsibility if a student has an IEP.
This is a question for you, Lawrence, that we received before the webinar. What is the difference between mediation and arbitration, and can both be used in one case?
Well, we don't call it arbitration. In Connecticut, we have a mediation program, which is a very informal process where if there's a dispute and both sides agree, because mediation is voluntary, the State Department of Education could appoint a mediator to try to resolve the dispute. We don't have arbitration. The alternative to mediation is going to a due process hearing, which is a very formal administrative hearing, a trial-like hearing with an independent hearing officer. When I'm involved, there's a third possibility, and that's called negotiation. And when I'm involved with a case, there are attorneys representing the school district, and we will get into formal settlement discussions called a resolution meeting after I file a request for a due process hearing. And the goal of the resolution meeting, the goal of mediation, is to try to find a solution that both the school district and the parents can buy into. Otherwise, there's no agreement. I don't know what the statistics are for mediation, but in Connecticut, approximately 95% of all the requests for due process hearings are settled, which means the parties are working towards the middle, whatever the middle is, rather than litigating who's right or wrong, except for those 5% of the cases that go forward to hearings. And when I first started doing this many, many years ago, just about everything went to a due process hearing, everything. Many, many years later, hardly anything goes to a due process hearing because the school district and their attorney and the parents and their attorney are working to negotiate something that both sides can buy into. Mediation, informal process, due process, a very formal trial-like hearing. And that's the difference. Arbitration, we don't have an arbitration system in Connecticut. For special ed, there is arbitration for other things like employment discrimination, but not for special education.
So we received another question before this webinar: how to help parents become empowered and not intimidated at all the professionals involved in special education process. Like many of you on this webinar, I've been at meetings, PPT meetings, where there might be 15 individuals sat around a table to discuss the progress of your child. Webinars such as ours, and as we mentioned, other resources out there can help you be informed. I think information gives you confidence and helps empower and embolden you to advocate for your child. However, it can be intimidating when you have so many people around the table. That's where it might be helpful for your first meeting or two to have somebody such as Allie or myself at your side, or to have the information provided by someone as Caryl or her team members who have insight into who your child is. But I think that the idea of this platform that we do here, this webinar, and the idea of most advocates is to give you the confidence to understand how to navigate the school system for your child, and to give you the tools by which to do it at some point independently. And that's what this webinar aims to do by bringing other professionals around the table to have these conversations. Information can help equip you to support your child. And know, just because you don't have a master's or a doctorate or maybe even an undergraduate degree does not mean that you don't have expertise to share, and that your expertise is just as valuable, if not more insightful, than some of the letters and the acronyms sat around a table. You are the parent, you know your child, and don't ever be afraid to use your voice, but also follow up in writing. Having things in written form can help you keep a track of what's been agreed, and also embolden what you have to say. Sometimes it's easier to say it in written form than it is to say it verbally as well. But any other ideas, Allie, Lawrence, or Caryl?
To add to that, I suggest empower yourself, be prepared for the meeting, PPT, 504, whatever the meeting, even a team meeting, be prepared. I urge my clients to always ask for evaluations, propose goals and objectives, any data that is going to be discussed at the PPT or whatever meeting it is. Ask for those prior to you coming to that meeting. I usually ask for it at least 2 school days before the meeting. So if I'm going to be participating at that meeting, I need some lead time to review the report. So you don't want to get the report the morning of the meeting. You need to have it in advance. So that will empower you, give you confidence before you even get to that meeting, and highlight certain areas or write down questions that you have about the report. If it is an initial evaluation PPT, you are entitled as parents and guardians to have a meeting with the evaluator prior to that PPT. That is an entitlement that you have. So you're supposed to be invited to a meeting, but if you are not invited, you can certainly request a meeting with the school psychologist, the speech and language therapist, whoever has done the evaluation, to meet before and have an informal, informative discussion on the evaluation results, so you don't hear it for the first time at that PPT. And I think that's a valuable avenue to do or to participate in, because it does give you that leverage before you even get to that meeting.
Knowledge is power, and that's what Allie is saying. And when you go to these meetings, if you write down ahead of time what your concerns are, you want to even provide it as your agenda. Often the schools will give you their agenda of what you want to talk about. And as Allie pointed out, you can say things verbally, but you need to follow up in writing. That's very important, that you're developing a written record. Sometimes it's advisable to go with a friend or a relative. When I often have both parents going to a PPT meeting, I advise them, one talks, the other writes. And that way you're keeping a record of the meeting. Or request that the meeting be recorded. So you have like tonight's webinar, you have a record of the meeting. And then the other thing is, when you get the IEP, look at it. Just don't put it in the sock drawer and forget about it. What you want to make sure is the record is reasonably accurate. And if it's not accurate or it's incomplete, send an email or a letter saying, I said this at the meeting, it's not in the IEP, please add it. Or I didn't agree to this. Whatever the areas of agreement, leave it alone. But if the IEP is incomplete or not accurate, you should make sure that you have an amendment, a request to amend the PPT meeting record.
If you have had some testing done and it's been decided that your child needs some accommodations for testing or quizzes, how do you actually know if those accommodations are being made?
Well, they're either being provided or they're not. Ask your child as a starting point if you're supposed to get extra time or an alternate test setting, or you do things manually or electronically, whatever the accommodation is, or you have a pass to go to the nurse or to the school counselor, whatever the accommodation is, it's either being provided or not. The problem with the problem with 504 plans versus IEP, there are no periodic progress reports. And so you need to, be, bird dogging your child's 504 plan and make sure that what's in there is being followed. And if it's not, you, just like with a PPT meeting, you ask for a 504 meeting. The 504 plan as written is not being delivered. What are you going to do to make sure that the teachers are following the 504 plan? And that's what you need to do. And
it's also important that, particularly for high school students, that they use the extended time, because in order to get extended time on your SAT and your ACT, you need to have used it in school. So it's really important that not only do they use it, but they understand why they need it. And there are kids who just say, I don't need the extended time, but really they do. And when they finally realize it, sometimes it's a little too late. And so we would want to make sure that they understand why they need it, that lots of other students also have it. They don't have to be embarrassed about it. And the more you use it, then you can, move on and use it in college, or at least on your SATs and your ACTs.
If your child is old enough, like middle school or high school, it's important that you assure yourself that they know what accommodations they're entitled to. We often, forget the fact that, these kids have either a 504 or an IEP, and sometimes they don't know themselves what accommodations they have on that form. So it's important that you ask your child, if they are old enough, what accommodations they have, and then they can certainly attest to the fact if they are being utilized. A mechanism that I'd like to use very frequently is the team method, or the team meeting method, I should say. I urge my families to have periodic team meetings that require the teachers, maybe not every single teacher at every meeting, but certainly you can arrange to see all the teachers sometime throughout the school year. And at those team meetings, you would question that, like what accommodations are being used. Can I see the modified tests? Can I, see, and again, ask them for specifics, whatever the accommodation is. If they are given a calculator for math, ask them, do you use the calculator? Are you sure that my child knows how to use the calculator, which is often a problem. So those team meetings can definitely be used to hold the teachers accountable and to have those informal discussions.
We've come to our quitting hour, so to speak, and I apologize that we haven't been able to get to all the questions tonight, but I have very good news. Allie and Caryl have graciously agreed to join us for our next webinar so we can continue tonight's discussion and address questions that we weren't able to get to this evening. And that next webinar will be on Wednesday, November 29th at 7 p.m. And if you have registered for tonight's webinar and you want to register for the next one, please do so, especially if you found this information informative. And if you want to send us questions in advance, even the questions that weren't answered tonight, please do so. So I want to thank everybody who's been with us throughout the evening. I want to especially thank our two guests, Allie and Caryl, and Jane, our co-host, who we all worked very hard to put this together. And Jane and I will keep a watchful eye on special education issues as they evolve between now and next month. But without my daughter, who's sitting to my immediate right off camera, we couldn't do all of this because she's doing all the technical behind the scenes work, the registration, making sure the technology works the way it's supposed to. And so I want to thank her as well, and our two guests. We welcome your questions, and I will leave it at that. Let Jane conclude with any remarks she has, as well as Caryl and Allie as well.
I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Thank you, Caryl and Allie. It's been a really informative conversation. I'm looking forward to our next one. And I just say to parents, if you have concerns, don't be afraid to ask questions. Your child has now been in school, for a good number of weeks. If you have concerns, start asking questions and meeting with the teachers, meeting with the team. Don't wait for the next marking period or for the next set of evaluations to come in. Go by your gut instinct. You know your child the best. And if something is concerning you, please address it and say something. Things don't need to wait. Some of your concerns could be alleviated with a question, and others might require a deeper dive. And be sure to reach out and contact people to bounce ideas from too. There's other people in your district that you might be able to share some shared experiences with that might also have additional insight that might be helpful for you as well. But thank you for coming tonight, Allie and Caryl.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. And I just want to end by saying that if you are a parent that is listening, you are the best advocate for your child. And nobody knows your child better than you do. As a parent, I can attest to that as well. So whatever we said tonight, your mission is to utilize the information and to empower yourself. But thank you again for coming tonight.
Allie and Jane said it beautifully. Thank you.
Coming from my heart. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
We'll see you next month. And I guess we'll have Thanksgiving in the meantime. So if everybody has Thanksgiving on the calendar, have a safe, enjoyable Thanksgiving holiday. And we'll see you right after that as well. Thank you and good night.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.